The tightest handcuffs I have ever felt were put on me while my cheek was pressed against a dumpster lid in the prettiest park in Cedar Hollow, like the town itself was trying to pretend nothing ugly could happen there. The officer leaned in close and growled, "Hands behind your back," and the way he said it made it clear this was not about the law, it was about teaching me a lesson. And while I stared at peeling green paint and tried not to breathe in that rancid heat, all I could think was, if he finds what's in my pocket, his whole world collapses, and if he doesn't, I might not make it out of this alive. My name is Kendra Hale, Assistant U.S. Attorney, which sounds fancy until you realize most days I'm just a woman in a gray suit reading other people's lies and trying to figure out where the truth got buried. And the reason I was wearing a Parks Department vest that morning was because an anonymous letter showed up on my desk like a warning label on a bottle. No stamp, no return address, just a single page written in shaky ink. They killed him at Riverside Commons. His name was Leland Brooks. They erased the report. The man behind it is Captain Darrell Rourke. If you come in loud, they will erase everything else too. And you have to understand, I've been in this job long enough to know the difference between a crank and a cry for help. That letter didn't rant, it didn't ramble, it named details. People only know when they've watched a thing happen and been forced to swallow it. I pulled Leland's name in the local system, and the file was almost empty. A couple moved along, contacts, one trespass warning, then nothing. Like the man never existed long enough to die. And that is not a glitch. That is a decision, a chain of decisions, a whole culture of we handle it here. And the longer I stared at that blank space, the heavier my chest got, because you start to realize the scariest thing about corruption isn't the crime, it's the quiet. I took the letter to my supervisor, Mason Pruitt, and Pruitt is one of those guys who never raises his voice, not because he's gentle, but because he doesn't waste energy. He read the page, slowly set it down, and said, "Small towns don't do corruption in small ways." Then he looked at me like he already knew what I was about to ask, and I said, "I don't want to roll in with a press conference. I want the truth before they burn the evidence," and he sighed like he hated how right I was. He slid a plain black bracelet across his desk. It looked like cheap fitness junk, and he said, "Press this and it pings my people, but only press it if you have to, because the second they know federal eyes are on them, they'll clean the board." Then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "If you do this, you stay boring, you stay invisible. You don't flash a badge, you don't threaten, you don't let your pride get you killed. You know what I mean?" I did know. I also knew I hated it because I did not become a prosecutor to hide in plain sight like prey. But sometimes justice starts as a whisper, because a shout gets you buried. So 2 days later, I was in steel-toe boots, a neon vest, and a city parks jacket that smelled like bleach and old leaves, holding a grabber stick and a trash bag, walking into Riverside Commons like I belonged there. And on the surface, it was exactly what a brochure would sell. Lake sparkling kids, laughing joggers doing their little loops, old couples feeding ducks, and yet the air felt off, like everyone was smiling with their teeth clenched, like every laugh had a shadow behind it. At the snack kiosk, a tired-eyed woman wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better years. She watched me in a way that wasn't friendly or rude, just measuring, and she asked, "You knew?" And I smiled with my best harmless face and said, "First day," and she nodded once quick and said, "Then do your job and don't do anybody else's." But her voice dipped on the last part like it hurt to say it out loud, like she was handing me a survival rule, not advice, and I walked away feeling that warning stick between my ribs. I kept my pace slow, bored on purpose, eyes down, hands steady, because the trick to undercover work isn't acting tough, it's acting forgettable. And I followed the lake trail until the ground changed. Grass flattened in a wide patch near a big oak, dirt churned in a line like something heavy had been dragged, and I crouched like I was just picking up a crushed can. But what I was really doing was reading the ground like a story. That's when I saw it. A thin shard of glass half buried under wet leaves, catching sunlight like a tiny blade, dark staining along one edge, old and dried and ugly, and my stomach turned because some part of me already knew what that stain was. I slid the shard into my pocket like it was nothing, like it was just another piece of trash, and I stood up slowly, heart thudding, face calm, and the second I stood up I felt it eyes on me from somewhere I couldn't see. Not curiosity, not the normal, "Who's the new worker?" but the kind of attention that says, "You are on my territory." "Hey!" a voice snapped from behind me, sharp enough to cut through the birds. "What are you doing over there?" I turned and saw Officer Sloan walking toward me, and Sloan wasn't the captain, but he had that posture of a man who's been told he can do what he wants and nobody will challenge it. His belt looked heavy with toys. His expression looked light with contempt. He stopped two close eyes on my hands. "You picked something up," he said. "I saw you pocket it, and I kept my voice even." "Just trash," I said, lifting the bag a little, like proof. And he smiled without warmth. "In this park, I decide what counts as trash." Then he tilted his head and asked, "What's your name?" And that question wasn't about my name. It was about my place. It was him trying to nail me to the ground with a label, and I could have given him something fake and sweet, but I gave him the one answer that always makes bullies angry. "I'm just trying to finish my shift," and for a second his eyes narrowed like he'd spotted a crack he could pry open. "Don't get cute," he said, and his fingers clamped around my wrist, hard, too hard for just talking. And I felt pain shoot up my arm, but I didn't yank away because yanking away is what they call resisting, and resisting is what they use as permission. "You don't have the right," I said, quiet but firm, and he laughed, like I'd told him a joke. "Rights?" He said, "Lady, your rights are whatever I say you got." And then he twisted my arm behind my back with the kind of force that isn't about safety, it's about dominance. Pain flared at my shoulder. My breath caught, and he shoved me forward into the dumpster enclosure like he wanted my face near the stink, like he wanted humiliation to stick to me. "Hands behind your back." He barked loud enough for people to hear, like he was putting on a show, and the cuffs came out, and he ratcheted them tight, tighter than they needed to be until metal bit skin, and I felt warmth under the edge. And here's the thing that still makes me angry when I replay it. People saw it, they heard it, and they looked away. A couple on the path slowed for half a second, took one look at the badge, and suddenly found their shoelaces fascinating. A jogger turned his head and sped up. A mom pulled her kid closer like silence was protection. And in that moment I understood Cedar Hollow's real disease wasn't just one bad cop. It was the town's trained reflex to survive by pretending. Sloan shoved me into the back of his cruiser without lights or sirens, like he didn't want the arrest to be a public record, just a private warning. And as we drove, I stared at the metal divider and thought about Leland Brooks, about how a human being can vanish twice, once in the dirt and once on paper. At the station, they dragged me into an interrogation room that smelled like disinfectant and old sweat, harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a young officer dug through my pockets with a grin like he'd been handed a new toy. Gloves. Sanitizer. A cheap water bottle he mocked like being prepared was suspicious. And then he pulled out my Credential wallet and his whole face brightened like Christmas. "Oh, wow," he said, laughing. "Department of Justice. Where'd you get this Etsy?" I leaned forward as much as the cuffs allowed and said, "Read it." And he snorted. "Yeah, okay." Like my words were entertainment, and the door opened. Captain Darrell Rourke stepped in like he owned the oxygen neat uniform. Calm eyes, the kind of calm that feels practiced, and the young officer tossed him my Credential, like it was a joke. "Look what she's carrying." Captain and Rourke flipped it under the light, and I watched the shift happen in real time. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes sharpened. Recognition first, then fear, then calculation. Like a man realizing he'd stepped on a landmine, and now he had to decide whether to freeze or run. He set the Credential on the table, metal tapping metal, and asked without looking at me, "Why was she arrested?" Sloan walked in behind him, arms crossed like he expected applause. "Restricted area," he said. "Refused orders." And Rourke finally looked at Sloan the way a boss looks at an employee who just broke something expensive. "Evidence," he asked, and Sloan hesitated. And that hesitation told me everything, because men like Sloan don't hesitate unless they're used to not needing facts. I lifted my cuffed hand slightly and said, "Your officer cuffed a park worker for picking up trash." And Sloan snapped. She was digging around, and I met his eyes and said, "If picking up a piece of glass is a crime, then your park isn't public, it's a crime scene you're trying to protect." And Rourke's stare sharpened at that, not because he cared about the park, but because he cared about what I might have seen. He leaned toward me, voice low. "What are you doing in my town?" And I smiled just a little, because sometimes humor is the only thing that keeps fear from owning you. "Working," I said. "And you're acting guilty." And for a flicker of a second, his calm mask slipped like anger wanted to jump out. Then it snapped back into place. He turned to his men and said, "No one talks about this." Then he pointed at me like I was an object. "She waits." And Sloan smirked like he'd won again. Bitter laughter rose in my throat, and I let a little out. Quiet is kind of Cedar Hollow's brand, isn't it? And Rourke's eyes went flat. "Cell 4, he ordered. No log, no phone, no lawyer. And then he looked at Sloan and said, "Wipe whatever needs wiping tonight," and that sentence landed in my chest like a cold weight, because it wasn't a threat, it was a plan. They shoved me down a back hallway where the lights were dimmer and the air felt damp, then into a holding cell that smelled like rust and wet concrete, and the door clanged shut with that final sound that tells you you've been moved out of the world where rules exist. I sat on the floor, wrists burning, listening to the station breathe, and under my sleeve I felt the smooth edge of Pruitt's bracelet, my panic button, and I could have pressed it right then. I could have saved myself fast. But I didn't come here only to save myself. I came here to prove what they did to Leland, and if I hit that button too early, they'd have time to erase the board. So I waited, counting slow breaths, staying calm on purpose, and outside my cell I heard Rourke's voice low and sharp. The feds don't come if nobody calls them, and I swear my skin went cold because that is the kind of logic that kills people and sleeps fine afterward. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe an hour. Time stretches when you're trapped, and then soft footsteps approached my bars, lighter than Sloane's hesitant, and a young officer stopped where the shadows pooled. Name tag said Evan Price, his face pale like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Ma'am," he whispered, barely moving his lips, "they're going to hurt you." And I studied him for a beat and said quietly, "You sent the letter," and his eyes flicked away like I'd hit a bruise. No denial, just fear, and I leaned closer and said, "If you meant it, prove it." And his hands shook as he pulled out his phone, like the thing weighed 100 pounds, and he typed with trembling thumbs, pausing like each word might get him killed, and I didn't breathe until I heard the soft little send chime, and yeah, that happened, a tiny sound that felt like thunder. Evan swallowed hard and stepped back, trying to look normal, but it was too late. Heavy footsteps charged the hallway. "What the hell are you doing?" Sloane roared, and Evan flinched, and then outside, cutting through the night like a blade. A siren rose sharp and unfamiliar, not local, not ambulance, the kind of siren you only hear when people with real authority show up. The station erupted like someone had thrown a match into gasoline. Voices shouting, radios squawking, chairs scraping, and then the front doors slammed open and boots thundered in. "Hands on your head." Face-the-wall flashlights carving the hallways into bright slices, and for the first time since I'd entered Cedar Hollow, I heard fear in the police station. Not the fear they put into others, the fear that comes from consequences. Keys rattled at my cell. The lock turned and a U.S. Marshal crouched in front of me. Eyes steady, voice firm, but human. "Ma'am, can you stand?" I pushed myself up, wrists screaming, and I couldn't help it. I said, "Yeah." "And you're late," and he gave me the tiniest look like he respected the bite in that line. They walked me out past Evan, pale and shaking against the wall with the rest. And I didn't hug him, I didn't celebrate, I just met his eyes long enough to say thank you without words because he wasn't a hero. He was a terrified kid who chose truth over safety, and sometimes that's the bravest thing in the room. Outside the parking lot flashed red and blue like a storm. Rourke stood cuffed silent, his calm mask gone, and Sloane fought and shouted, throwing excuses like confetti. "You've been fooled." She set this up and nobody cared because the moment federal boots hit that floor, the town's usual silence couldn't swallow reality fast enough. Back at the federal building, the evidence started stacking. The glass shard tested positive for Leland Brooks's blood. GPS data showed patrol units making off-the-book stops at the lake trail again and again. A tech recovered shaky video from an old phone Leland kept at the shelter. A cruiser with lights off. A man's voice laughing in the dark. And it wasn't perfect footage. It didn't need to be. It was real. And real is what breaks lies. In court, Rourke's attorney tried to make me the problem. Why undercover? Why not a warrant? Why risk contaminating the scene? And I looked at the jury and said, because in Cedar Hollow people disappear. And if I came in loud, they would have erased everything. Like they tried to erase Leland, and you could feel the room shift because even people who love the police get quiet when they realize the paperwork was empty on purpose. Evan testified too, voice shaking, but he told the truth. Missing reports, late-night rides, jokes about making someone go away, and nobody laughed. Then not one person, because suddenly those weren't jokes, they were confessions. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, it hit the room like a gavel inside your chest. Rourke's face went empty. Sloane stared at the floor, and Cedar Hollow didn't cheer. It just breathed like a person surfacing after being held underwater too long. And I wish I could tell you that's where it ended clean. Satisfying, case closed. But life isn't that neat. You know what I mean? After sentencing, after the cameras wandered off and the courthouse steps emptied, a black sedan with no visible plates waited at the curb, and a woman in a dark coat stepped out, calm as a metronome. She handed me a matte black card with a single line etched into it. "Some fires don't start themselves," and she said, "We've been watching you. You walked into the dark and didn't blink, and I asked, "Who are you?" And she tilted her head like the question amused her. "People who are tired of waiting," she said. "Call the number when you're ready to see how wide this really is." Then she got back in the car and disappeared into traffic, leaving me standing there holding that card and wondering if the next step toward justice is always legal or just necessary. So here's what I want to know from you, and I mean really know, not the polite answer. If you lived in a town where a badge scares people more than criminals, where neighbors watch abuse and look away because they've been trained to survive, what would you want someone like me to do? Do you believe justice has to stay inside the lines even when the lines are drawn by corrupt hands? Or are there moments when the only way to protect people is to step into the dark and risk becoming the target yourself? And be honest, was I right to go undercover and gamble my life to catch them clean, or did I cross a line no prosecutor should cross even for a good cause? Drop your take in the comments, argue with each other if you have to. Because silence is how places like Cedar Hollow keep breathing. And if you've ever witnessed abuse of authority class, bias, prejudice, or that sick small-town quiet where everybody saw nothing, tell your story too. I read those, all of them. And if you want more real cinematic truth first stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes power should answer to the truth.